Hi everyone and welcome to Brick Arena. Over the last week or so I've had several questions come in from viewers and subscribers essentially asking the same question, which is how do I decide which sets to buy for part out in my Bricklink store? So I thought I'd take the opportunity to discuss a few of the things to consider when you're buying parts for sale. Before we get into too much detail, I think some of the first things that you need to consider is what is your overall strategy of your store. Are you perhaps focused on selling bulk parts, for instance? So you might in this case want to think about concentrating on sets that offer high quantities of a particular part. And usually the creative sets are quite good for this. If you buy creative sets in high quantity, then you're going to generate a lot of bulk, maybe bulk 2x4 bricks, etc. Now, in addition to that, you might want to be a store that has a broader selection. So maybe your intention is just to have a really wide selection of parts that attracts to almost anybody. And then you're going to look at each type of set with the same kind of merits. So you won't care about theme particularly, you won't care about colour maybe, you'll just be looking for probably the best margin or profit that you can make on each of the sets. Now maybe you're a minifig seller, so in those cases you would want to be looking at sets with a particular focus on minifigures. And maybe you don't even sell the parts themselves. I've seen a lot of sellers simply sell the minifigures out of the set separately and then sell the rest of the set separately as well. They never get into breaking out all of the parts and selling the parts individually. Now, next up, you want to be thinking about who is your target audience. And again, touching on that sort of broader selection, are you going to be a generalist kind of seller? You're going to be selling to everybody? Or are you going to be a bit more specialist? Maybe your store focuses specifically on Technic parts, for instance, where you're going to be selling to Technic builders. Maybe you're going to focus on a specific niche. Maybe you're going to target more of a female audience, not being sexist at all, but you know, by buying sets like friend sets or elf sets, for instance, you're going to be focusing on a lot of different color palette maybe that might be more attractive to those people. Or maybe again you're going to be focusing on minifig collectors specifically. So think about who is your audience and what is your strategy first of all before you start to think about which sets you're actually going to buy. Now, when you are starting to look at the sets, what is it that you need to look for? Well, of course, one of the things that everybody focuses on is discount. You know, what is the amount of discount that you need to get to make the set viable for sale? Unfortunately, it's not really as simple as just looking at the discount, and we'll touch on that in a little while. Of course, you want to be looking for the biggest discount, but that's not the only thing to consider. You also need to consider what is the sales value of the item, and you typically do that by looking at the 6-month sales average on Bricklink, which will tell you over the last 6 months what is the average price that a particular part or set has sold for over those 6 months. Now you can also look at what is the current sales value. That means that for the parts in that set, it will tell you what the average price is that those parts are selling for or on offer for from current sellers. So think about that. Another thing you need to think about though is what is the resale value of any minifigures that might be in the set. And for that I usually tend to look on eBay. To be honest, I sell the majority of my minifigures through eBay. I find that they sell more easily and they sell for a higher sales price. That doesn't necessarily mean they sell for the biggest profit, and we'll talk about that in a while. But I do find that the figures in particular go quite well on eBay personally. You also need to think about what is the current availability of the parts that are in that set. So when you start to investigate the set in a little bit more detail, you might find that some of the availability of at least some of the parts is pretty scarce. If you find parts that are on offer from hundreds of sellers, then maybe you want to think about, do you really want to compete with all of those hundreds of sellers selling those same parts? Now, you also want to think about how long has the set been around for? How long has it been in production? Because that's going to have an impact on what expected discount you'd expect to get. And a lot of people, we're talking about sets that go on sale. Some people have a very good model of buying brand new sets at full retail price when they can sell the figures and the parts at their highest value, because maybe they're new parts, they're new minifigures, so they can still actually make a good profit by paying full price. Now, the longer and older that the set is, then you're going to expect to probably get a bigger discount. And there are some tools online. If you look at tools like Keeper on Amazon, then you can track what the sales value has been over a period of time. So that gives you a good indication of whether you're getting a good deal on the amount of discount being offered or not, or maybe it's been lower in the past and you want to wait and see if it comes back down to that kind of level again. Of course, the age of the item is going to have an impact on the availability. So the longer it's been around, you're going to have had more sellers picking the item up from various retailers at different selling prices, and there's going to be more of them for sale, or the parts of those for sale on Bricklink. So again, you might be competing with more people there. The other thing is, what is the accuracy of the figures, of the 6-month figures? So for instance, if it's an older set, then the 6 months average might not be as accurate, because some of the sales that are attributed to the average price may have been at quite a high price when the set was new. So typically the parts will attract a higher value when they're first released. The price will start to decline over the life of the set typically. Some other things to look out for. What are the minifigures that are included? Minifigures can account for a huge proportion of the value of the set. So quite often sellers like me will sell the minifigures separately. They'll often get a quick return on the minifigure sales, and that will enable them to get the money back on the set, and then all of the rest of the parts are kind of profit, if you like. They put those parts into the store, and it doesn't matter how long they sit there really, because you've already made at least your money back on the set from the sale of the minifigures. So you want to consider what are the minifigures? Does it have good minifigures? Are there minifigures that people really want? How many minifigures are they? Are they proper minifigures, or are they things like, like in the Star Wars sets, there may be just some sort of battle droid or something which don't have quite the same value. So think about the minifigures in particular when looking at a set. Of course, minifigures aren't everything. Again, if you're selling in a bulk your strategy is to sell bulk, then you're going to be buying a lot of creative sets. Creative sets aren't going to have minifigures in, or at least not many of them. So maybe you're not interested in the minifigures. It all will depend on what your strategy is, what price you can get the set for, etc. You also want to think about what is the cost per part. So if you look at the price of the set that you're going to pay, look at the number of the parts in that set, and simply do a quick calculation to tell you what is the price of each part. And in something like some of the classic brick sets, for instance, set 10704 I think it is, which is a big creativity box with 900 parts. I've been getting that for anywhere between £15 and £20, and that makes the price per part anywhere between 1.5 pence per part to 2.2 pence per part. So you need to think about what is the price per part. Of course, you know, in a set you're going to have lots of different parts. Some of them will have a much higher value than others, so it's just a general rule of thumb. Another thing to look for in the set is there any rare or high value items in there, especially if they're new parts that are going to be attractive. Things like when the roller coaster parts started to emerge, there were some good sets that had lots of spare roller coaster track, and those for me were a good seller, for instance. Also things like animals, some of the sets recently with the range of tigers in the city set, so I think that, you know, there's been a panther, a saber-toothed tiger, etc., and those are good sellers as well. So animals, minifigures, and parts like the burps and lerps, there's usually have a good value. So do look through the parts list for the set, and you know, do a little bit of research. Think about also what quantity are you going to buy the set in. Sometimes you see a great deal on a set, but there's only one of them or only two of them. Now, parting out one or two of a set is not very cost effective in terms of time and storage. You're going to spend almost as long parting out one or two sets as you will parting out 10, and you'll need exactly the same storage capacity typically, assuming you're going to put one part in one location. So you really want to be looking for sets where you're going to be parting out in quantity, and the quantity is up to you. I mean, you know, I'll do quantities of 5 or 10 are great. You know, some sellers out there probably do, you know, 20 at least. But, you know, think about the quantity. Of course, it's fine to pick up sets cheap. I do that from time to time, where I only see one or two. But what I do that with the aim of kind of stockpiling it until I can buy more of the same set from other resellers at good prices. And then when I've got an appropriate quantity, then I'll part the set out. So what are some other considerations you might want to think of? Well, you need to think about maybe how quickly are you going to part the set out, because that's probably going to have an impact on the resale value. Remember, if you're buying new sets and they've got new parts in, there's going to be high demand, and they'll demand a high price to begin with, but that price will decline over time. So if you take your time parting them out, you're likely to get less return on those parts than you might have done at the start. You also need to think about how long are you prepared to hold on to the parts for, because a lot of parts are really slow moving, and if I were to look in my store, I'm sure there's lots of parts in there that probably haven't turned over in a year or two even, you know. So of course there's strategies for dealing with those, reviewing and reducing prices, etc. But, you know, think about how long are you prepared to sit on some of these parts. Think about, do you have the storage space for the sets, both in a set form, you know, where you've got to store it in a box, on shelves, whatever, and when you've parted them out, when you've got to have containers for all of these, do you have the space for it all? It's amazing how quickly these things build up. When you're getting big hauls on a regular basis, are you going to be able to you know, get those parted out and into your store quickly? You really need to know your market as well. Know who your customers are. Going back to the strategy, what is your strategy? Does this set fit with that strategy? Do your research. Again, look on Bricklink, look at what parts come in the set, what's the quantity of parts, what's the cost per part, are there new parts, all of the stuff that I've mentioned already. But at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to gut feel. Sometimes you're in a store, or and you've only, you know, there's only one or two on the shelves, you need to make a quick decision, or maybe there's a sale on Amazon, you're not sure how long it's going to be there. sometimes you need to just use your gut and think, is that a good deal? And you'll know when a deal is particularly good, and then when it is, make sure that you jump on it. Now, of course, one of the things you have to do is you have to do your sums. So you have to think about how cheaply can you buy this particular set. So this goes back to the discount, and this is what everyone gets hung up on. You know, what is the amount of discount I need to get to make it viable? As I said, it really depends on lots of other factors, but you know, anything above, you know, 25 to 50%, I'd say, you know, start and do your research and see whether those are going to make good sets to buy. Just because a set can be obtained relatively cheaply with good discount doesn't mean the parts are going to resell easily. So do beware of that. You need to look at what the sales value is, and you also need to look at what the costs of selling those parts are. And the cost that you need to think about is, what is it going to cost you to sell them? Because wherever you decide to sell them, or by and large where you decide, places like, let's take eBay first, for instance. eBay is a place I use. I sell a lot of my minifigures on there. But what you're going to experience with eBay is you're typically going to get quite high fees. But with those high fees, and they're around 10%, you're going to get exposure to probably the biggest audience there is out there. So you're going to get lots of eyes looking at your ads with massive potential to sell. But again, you got to think about, you know, the value on eBay is where you're probably going to move your minifigures quite easily on there. Now compare eBay to Bricklink and Brickowl. The fees are much lower on these sites. I think they're typically around 3% or so. But that's reflected in the sales price of the minifigures as well. If you look on Bricklink, you'll probably see that minifigures sell more cheaply on Bricklink than they do on eBay. But keep in mind that typically on eBay, sellers tend to include the shipping, which they'll build into the sales price, whereas in Bricklink the shipping's charged extra, so the sales price of the minifigure seems to be lower. Think about the PayPal fees. You need to think about how much it's going to cost you to receive the money. There's always a PayPal fee involved, plus a percentage of the value, and that can build up. Now, this is going to depend on whether you're a business seller or a private seller. Business sellers will get reduced PayPal fees, and in some cases, depending on what you're selling and what prices you're selling, you may be able to have micropayments turned on, which again means that you'll get a much smaller fee for cheaper items. Don't dismiss the cost of shipping and packaging as well, though. Packaging materials cost money. It costs to put parts in your little bags and your padded envelopes or your boxes, etc. And of course shipping costs as well. And as I said, shipping on eBay, for me, I tend to include that in the price. So it's kind of transparent to the buyer. Whereas on Bricklink and Brickowl, the shipping is charged separately, in my case usually at cost. So at the end of the day, it's really all about the margin that you're going to make, or the profit that you're going to make on the sale of the set, rather than necessarily focusing on the discount. So you've got to think about what is the costs of buying the set first of all, plus the cost of selling it versus that sales price. And that's going to give you the margin that you're going to make, or the profit that you're going to make on those parts. Now I'd recommend, after doing your sums, calculating sets on a minimum return of a 2.5 times part out value. So that means essentially if you buy a set for £10, you at least want to be able to sell it for 2.5 times that amount. So do focus on the margin more than the discount. And that's about everything, I think. Now, of course, that's my opinion. You know, I don't make my living at selling on Bricklink or Brickowl. It's a hobby for me, but it's, you know, it can be a lucrative business, shall we say? But you know, you've got to be prepared to put the time and effort in, and not everything you buy is going to be a success. You'll end up sat on some parts longer than you might have thought. So I hope this has given you some food for thought about the process, or some things to think about when you're out there buying your sets for Bricklink, and hopefully you'll feel a little more informed when you're making those decisions. So hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give me a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe to the channel. If you've got more questions, I'm happy to answer them in both the comments or in a video format like this from time to time. Not a problem at all. So thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye for now.